January 17th, 1978. Somewhere above a vast chain of frozen mountains, a passenger aircraft carrying 43 people disappeared from radar. There was no distress call, no explosion reported by witnesses, no emergency beacon that rescuers could follow. One moment, Flight 214 was moving steadily toward its destination. The next, it was simply gone. Within hours, a violent snowstorm swallowed the mountains beneath its last known position, covering valleys, ridges, and forests beneath a new layer of white. Search aircraft circled the region for days. Helicopters followed every possible route. Rescue teams crossed frozen passes on foot. They found nothing. Not a piece of metal. Not a suitcase. Not a footprint. After 12 days, officials announced what the families had feared from the beginning. There was almost no chance anyone could still be alive. But they were wrong. Nearly 3 weeks after the aircraft vanished, a forestry worker traveling through an isolated valley noticed something strange in the snow. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree. Then sunlight reflected from a smooth surface beneath the ice. He moved closer and uncovered a section of painted metal. A few yards away, another shape emerged from the snow. It was part of an aircraft wing. He immediately turned back for help. When rescuers finally reached the valley, they expected to find the remains of Flight 214 and nothing more. Instead, as they approached the wreckage, one of the rescuers stopped. There were footprints in the snow. Fresh footprints. They followed them toward the shattered fuselage and saw movement near a makeshift shelter built against the side of the aircraft. Then a figure appeared. Thin, exhausted, wrapped in layers of torn clothing and blankets, the person raised one arm toward them. Someone was alive. And then another passenger appeared. And another. Against everything the search teams had believed possible, people had survived inside the frozen valley for weeks. But finding them would reveal an even stranger question. If the aircraft had been lying there all along, why had hundreds of hours of searching failed to find it? And what exactly happened during the final minutes before Flight 214 disappeared? The morning began without anything that suggested it would become extraordinary. Flight 214 was scheduled to make a routine journey across the Northern Mountain Corridor, a route flown regularly by commercial aircraft connecting several isolated cities during the winter months. The aircraft itself was not new, but maintenance records showed no serious problems. The crew had flown the route before. Most of the passengers had no reason to think about the mountains beneath them at all. For them, the flight was simply a few hours between departure and arrival, an inconvenience separating one part of their lives from another. At the terminal, passengers arrived carrying the ordinary objects of ordinary journeys. Small suitcases, winter coats, newspapers folded beneath arms, gifts wrapped for relatives, business documents tucked into leather cases. Parents checked tickets while children stared through the terminal windows at aircraft moving slowly across the icy runway. Outside, ground crews worked beneath a pale winter sky while vapor drifted around the engines. Among the passengers were families returning home, workers traveling between cities, 2 university students, a retired teacher, a salesman, and several people visiting relatives. Most had never met one another. Within hours, they would depend on each other for almost everything. The weather report available before departure showed snow developing later in the day, but nothing unusual for the region. Winter storms were common across the mountains, and pilots were accustomed to navigating around them. The flight crew reviewed the forecast, calculated fuel requirements, and prepared for departure. There was no reason to cancel. At 9:17 that morning, Flight 214 left the runway. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. The aircraft climbed above a blanket of clouds and settled into cruise. Passengers removed coats, adjusted seats, opened books, and watched the white landscape occasionally appearing through gaps below. From that altitude, the mountains looked almost peaceful. Long ridges stretched toward the horizon, their peaks covered with snow, their valleys hidden beneath clouds. Inside the cockpit, however, the weather was beginning to change. A storm system moving across the range had strengthened faster than predicted. Winds increased. Clouds thickened along the planned route. Reports from other aircraft described turbulence and rapidly deteriorating visibility. The pilots began discussing an adjustment to their course, hoping to avoid the worst of the weather. At approximately 10:41, Air Traffic Control instructed Flight 214 to maintain altitude, while controllers evaluated traffic ahead. The crew acknowledged the instruction. It was one of the final clear transmissions anyone would hear from the aircraft. Minutes later, the plane entered dense cloud. Passengers near the windows could no longer see the mountains. The bright morning disappeared, replaced by a gray wall outside the glass. Turbulence began gently, then became stronger. Cups shook on trays. Overhead compartments rattled. A flight attendant moved through the cabin, asking passengers to fasten their seat belts. Nobody panicked. Not yet. Bad weather was uncomfortable, but it was not unusual. Then the aircraft descended. Some passengers noticed the change immediately because of the pressure in their ears. Others felt the engines change tone. The descent was not violent, but it continued longer than expected. Outside, visibility remained almost non-existent. In the cockpit, the pilots were trying to determine exactly where they were. Navigation equipment of that era depended heavily on radio signals and instruments that could become less reliable in mountainous terrain. Strong winds had also pushed the aircraft farther from its expected route than the crew initially realized. The pilots believed they were approaching a broad valley that would allow them to descend beneath the worst of the storm. Instead, they were moving toward a much narrower section of the mountains. At 10:56, controllers attempted to contact Flight 214. There was no response. They called again. Nothing. At first, nobody assumed disaster. Radio communication could become unreliable near the mountains, particularly during severe weather. Controllers continued trying to establish contact while monitoring the aircraft's expected position. But Flight 214 never reappeared. Inside the cabin, passengers suddenly felt the aircraft turn sharply. The engines grew louder. A flight attendant grabbed the nearest seat and shouted for everyone to remain seated. Then, through the clouds, the mountains appeared. They were much closer than anyone expected. A passenger sitting near the front would later remember seeing nothing but white through the window, snow rushing past beneath them, so close that individual rocks and trees became visible. Another remembered hearing the engines rise to full power. The pilots had finally realized the danger. The aircraft climbed. For several seconds, it seemed they might escape. Then the right wing struck something hidden beneath the snow. The impact tore through the aircraft with a sound passengers would never forget. The plane twisted violently. Luggage fell from overhead compartments. Lights went out. People screamed as the aircraft struck the mountainside, bounced across deep snow, and began sliding downward. But the snow that had hidden the mountain also did something unexpected. It absorbed part of the impact. Instead of striking exposed rock at full speed, the aircraft crashed into a deep accumulation of fresh powder covering a steep slope. The fuselage broke apart in several places, but the central cabin remained partially intact. Momentum carried it hundreds of feet downward until it finally stopped inside a narrow valley, surrounded by enormous walls of snow and rock. For several seconds afterward, there was complete silence. Then someone coughed. Another person began calling for help. A child started crying. The people who could move slowly realized something almost impossible. They had survived the crash. They did not yet understand that surviving the impact had been only the beginning. Outside, snow was already falling heavily enough to erase the aircraft from the landscape. And hundreds of miles away, search teams were about to begin looking for Flight 214 in the wrong place. The first minutes after the crash were filled with confusion. Inside the damaged cabin, darkness made it difficult to understand what had happened. Sections of the ceiling had collapsed. Seats had been torn from their mounts. Snow had entered through openings in the fuselage, and freezing wind moved through the aircraft. Those who could stand began calling out, trying to determine who was conscious and who needed help. Nobody yet knew where they were. Nobody knew whether the pilots had managed to send a distress signal. Most believed rescue aircraft would soon be searching directly above them. The survivors worked almost instinctively. People who had been strangers only hours earlier began helping one another out of damaged seats and away from the most exposed sections of the cabin. The cold became the immediate enemy. Whatever protection the aircraft had once provided was disappearing quickly as wind pushed snow through broken windows and damaged panels. They gathered coats, blankets, luggage, seat covers, and anything else that could provide insulation. A relatively intact section near the middle of the fuselage became their shelter. Openings were covered with luggage and pieces of interior paneling in an attempt to keep the wind outside. They searched for supplies before daylight disappeared. Bags scattered around the wreckage contained clothing, snacks, medicine, matches, and other small items that suddenly became extraordinarily valuable. Emergency equipment from the aircraft provided additional materials, but far less than they hoped. Nobody had prepared to survive for weeks in a frozen mountain valley. Everything aboard the plane had been designed around the assumption that passengers would reach an airport within hours. The crew attempted to determine whether the emergency radio could still function. The impact had damaged critical systems, and repeated attempts produced no meaningful response. Portable equipment offered little improvement. The mountains surrounding the valley created another problem. Even a working transmitter might struggle to reach anyone beyond the enormous walls of rock around them. Still, there was confidence during those first hours. An aircraft carrying dozens of people could not simply disappear. Controllers knew their route. Officials knew approximately where communication had stopped. Search aircraft would come. The survivors only needed to remain together and make themselves visible. Then the storm intensified. Snow fell so heavily that the mountains disappeared completely. Wind swept across the wreckage, filling tracks almost as quickly as people created them. Several survivors attempted to place brightly colored materials outside the aircraft, hoping they would be visible from the air, but accumulating snow repeatedly covered them. By evening, portions of the fuselage that had been clearly exposed after the crash were already disappearing beneath white drifts. The temperature fell sharply after sunset. The survivors crowded into the protected section of the cabin. There was barely enough room. They sat shoulder to shoulder, using coats and blankets wherever possible. Conversation became quieter as darkness settled over the valley. Every unfamiliar sound caused people to listen. Some thought they heard aircraft engines beyond the storm. Others insisted it was only wind moving through the mountains. During the night, several people spoke about what would happen the next morning. Rescue planes would arrive as soon as the weather cleared. Helicopters would follow the route. They would see the wreckage. By tomorrow evening, everyone told themselves they might be somewhere warm. But morning brought more snow. Far away, the disappearance of Flight 214 had already triggered a large search operation. Controllers reconstructed its final communications. Military and civilian aircraft were assigned sectors. Teams studied maps and weather reports, attempting to estimate how far the plane could have traveled after losing contact. The problem was that the estimates were based on the aircraft being where everyone thought it had been. The storm had pushed Flight 214 away from its expected path before the crash. The difference seemed small on a large map, but in the mountains it was enormous. A few miles could place an aircraft behind an entirely different ridge, inside another valley, invisible from the route search pilots expected it to have followed. The survivors knew none of this. On the second day, the weather finally improved enough for brief patches of blue sky to appear. People climbed carefully onto the snow around the aircraft and searched the horizon. For the first time, they could see the place where they had landed. The sight changed the mood immediately. Mountains surrounded them in every direction. There were no roads. No buildings. No electrical lines. No smoke from distant houses. The aircraft rested at the bottom of a valley so narrow that parts of the sky were hidden behind steep ridges. Deep snow covered almost everything. Then someone heard an engine. Everyone rushed outside. A small aircraft appeared between the clouds, distant but unmistakable. People shouted. They waved clothing above their heads. Several survivors climbed onto the fuselage. Others attempted to expose more of the aircraft by clearing snow from its surface. The search plane continued across the mountains. For several seconds, it seemed to turn toward them. Then it disappeared behind a ridge. They waited for it to return. It never did. The excitement slowly became silence. For the first time, the survivors understood the possibility none of them had wanted to consider. The searchers might not know where they were. Over the following days, aircraft were occasionally heard or glimpsed high above the mountains, but none approached the valley closely enough to indicate that the wreckage had been spotted. Each appearance produced the same desperate ritual. People ran outside. They waved. They arranged materials against the snow. They shouted even though they knew nobody inside an aircraft thousands of feet above could hear them. And each time, the sound eventually faded. Food became the next concern. What they had recovered from luggage, and the aircraft was limited. At first, supplies had been distributed cautiously but without strict rules because everyone expected rescue within days. Now portions became smaller. Every item was counted. Nothing edible could be wasted. The cold was relentless. During daylight, sunlight occasionally warmed the exposed metal of the fuselage, but temperatures collapsed after dark. Survivors learned to block openings before sunset and remain close together through the night. They developed routines because routine created the feeling that they still had some control. Snow was collected and melted. Supplies were inventoried. The aircraft was searched repeatedly for useful materials. People took turns watching the sky. By the end of the first week, the wreckage looked different. Snow had covered much of the aircraft. From above, the white fuselage blended into the valley. Shadows from the surrounding mountains made identification even more difficult. What seemed enormous to the survivors below could appear as nothing more than an irregular line in the snow to a pilot passing overhead. On the 8th day, they heard aircraft again. This time there were two. Everyone emerged from the shelter. Some passengers cried as they waved toward the sky. One aircraft crossed the far end of the valley. The second remained visible longer. Then both disappeared. That evening, nobody spoke about being rescued the next morning. The survivors were beginning to understand that waiting might not be enough. Somewhere beyond those mountains there had to be a road, a village, a forestry station, something. But reaching it meant leaving the only shelter they had. And nobody knew what waited beyond the ridge. Hundreds of miles away, the disappearance of Flight 214 had become national news. Photographs of passengers appeared in newspapers. Television reports showed families waiting inside airports while officials stood beside enormous maps covered with lines representing possible flight paths. Every morning brought the same question: had anything been found? And every evening brought the same answer: nothing. The search operation had grown quickly during the first days. Aircraft flew along the planned route and then expanded outward into neighboring valleys. Helicopters attempted to inspect areas that fixed-wing aircraft could not safely approach. Ground teams moved toward locations where residents reported unusual sounds or distant flashes on the morning of the disappearance. Each report created hope. Each search ended the same way. The mountains made everything difficult. From the air, the landscape seemed endless. Snow-covered roads, rocks, forests, and open ground with the same pale surface. Shadows changed throughout the day, creating shapes that could resemble wreckage from a distance. Search pilots repeatedly descended toward dark objects only to discover exposed stone or fallen trees. The weather also changed, without warning. A valley visible in the morning could disappear behind clouds an hour later. Flight 214 was hidden inside one of the most difficult places to observe from above. The fuselage had stopped close to a steep mountainside where snow accumulated rapidly. Its upper surface was white. Its wings were partially buried. The storm following the crash had softened the marks created when the aircraft slid into the valley. Even the long scar it had carved across the slope was gradually disappearing. There was another problem the searchers did not understand. Their calculations placed the aircraft farther east. Investigators reconstructed the final portion of the flight using radar information, radio transmissions, predicted winds, and the aircraft's expected speed. Everything pointed toward a broad search area, but the actual crash site sat just beyond its western boundary. Search aircraft occasionally passed near the valley, sometimes close enough for the survivors to hear them, but they were usually looking in another direction. Inside the wreckage, the passengers had no way of knowing this. They assumed that every aircraft they heard was searching directly for them. When one passed without reacting, they could only conclude that the wreckage was nearly invisible. By the 10th day, the survivors had created a disciplined routine. Morning began with an inspection of the shelter. Snow that accumulated overnight had to be removed from important openings while other snow was collected for water. Supplies were checked. Anyone capable of moving outside helped expose sections of the aircraft whenever weather permitted. They tried creating large signals in the snow using dark pieces of luggage and material removed from the cabin. The results were frustrating. Wind destroyed their work. Fresh snowfall covered it. Materials disappeared beneath drifting snow within hours. Maintaining a signal large enough to be seen from the air required energy they could barely afford to spend. Food had become the subject nobody could avoid. The original supplies were almost gone. A few passengers had carried snacks, chocolate, nuts, crackers, and other small foods in their luggage. The aircraft had limited catering supplies. Everything had been collected and divided carefully, but there was no realistic way to make it last indefinitely. The survivors reduced portions again. They also began searching the aircraft more carefully, not only for food but for anything that might help them leave. Maps were especially valuable. One damaged chart recovered from the cockpit became the center of long discussions. It showed mountains, navigation points, and several settlements, but determining their own location was extremely difficult. Without knowing exactly where the aircraft had left its planned route, the map offered possibilities rather than answers. A crew member tried reconstructing the final minutes before impact. He remembered headings, estimated speeds, and the direction of the wind. Others compared the position of the sun with the surrounding ridges. Slowly, they developed a rough theory. If they were correct, civilization might lie beyond the mountains to the southwest. The word might mattered. A journey in the wrong direction could lead deeper into wilderness. For now, they continued waiting. On the 11th day, the weather became unusually clear. The sky turned deep blue, and visibility extended across several mountain ranges. The survivors believed this would finally be the day they were found. They uncovered as much of the aircraft as possible and prepared their signals. Before noon, they heard engines. A search aircraft appeared. It was closer than any they had seen before. People ran into the open, waving coats and pieces of fabric. Someone used a reflective surface recovered from the aircraft to flash sunlight toward the plane. The aircraft approached the valley, and for a moment the survivors became convinced it had seen them. It flew almost directly overhead. Some people laughed. Others cried. Several began gathering belongings, certain that helicopters would arrive soon. Then the aircraft continued north. No helicopter came. Hours passed. By sunset, hope had transformed into something much darker. If a search aircraft could pass almost directly above them without seeing the wreckage, then remaining beside the plane might eventually become a death sentence. That same evening, a serious discussion began. Someone would have to leave. Not everyone agreed. The aircraft was shelter. It contained materials, supplies, and the largest possible signal for rescuers. Standard survival advice generally favored remaining near a crash site because rescuers would search for the aircraft, not individuals walking through wilderness. But that logic depended on the search continuing. The passengers had no idea how long authorities would keep sending aircraft. The answer came sooner than they expected. On the 12th day, far beyond the mountains, officials held a difficult meeting. Search crews had flown hundreds of hours. Weather forecasts showed another major storm approaching. Every calculation suggested that anyone who had survived the initial crash would now have endured almost 2 weeks of extreme winter conditions with limited supplies. The probability of finding survivors was being described as increasingly remote. Families protested any suggestion that the operation should be reduced. Some insisted the aircraft could have made an emergency landing. Others argued that no wreckage meant there was still hope. But resources were not unlimited. The following day, the number of search flights decreased. The survivors noticed. The sky became quieter. On the 14th day, they heard only one distant aircraft. On the 15th, none. That evening, the group gathered inside the damaged fuselage as darkness filled the valley. The temperature was falling again, and another storm could be seen moving across the peaks. Nobody needed to say what everyone was thinking. The outside world was beginning to stop looking for them. The discussion about leaving was no longer theoretical. They studied the damaged map again. They examined the mountains. They estimated how far a person could travel through deep snow during daylight. They gathered the warmest clothing they could find and considered who among them was strong enough to attempt the journey. It would be extraordinarily dangerous. But waiting had become dangerous too. By the following morning, 2 passengers had volunteered. Their plan was simple, because nothing more complicated was possible. Climb out of the valley, cross the ridge, head southwest, and keep walking until they found another human being. They had no idea that the decision would eventually lead rescuers back toward Flight 214. But before that happened, the mountain would test them in ways none of them had imagined. The 2 volunteers began preparing before sunrise. There was no proper expedition equipment aboard Flight 214, so almost everything they carried had to be improvised from what remained inside the aircraft. They layered shirts, sweaters, jackets, and coats. Extra fabric was wrapped around their hands and feet. Pieces of waterproof material were cut from damaged sections of the cabin and used to protect their clothing from snow. They carried a small amount of food, a container for melting snow, matches protected from moisture, pieces of the damaged map, and a few objects that might help them signal an aircraft if they reached higher ground. The rest of the survivors watched quietly. Everyone understood the contradiction. They wanted the 2 men to leave because someone had to find help, but watching them walk away meant losing 2 of the strongest people in the group. If the expedition failed, the men might never return. If another storm arrived before they crossed the mountains, nobody inside the wreckage would know what had happened to them. Before leaving, the volunteers agreed on one rule. For the first part of the journey, they would mark their path whenever possible. If conditions became impossible before they crossed the ridge, they would turn around and follow those marks back to the aircraft. Shortly after sunrise, they stepped away from Flight 214. At first, the journey seemed almost manageable. The weather was clear, and sunlight reflected from the valley with painful brightness. But the scale of the landscape was deceptive. A ridge that appeared close enough to reach within an hour remained distant after several hours of walking. Deep snow made every step difficult. Sometimes they sank only to their ankles. In other places, they dropped suddenly almost to their knees and had to pull themselves forward. The survivors at the aircraft watched the 2 figures gradually become smaller. Eventually, they disappeared behind a rise. For the first time since the crash, the group had divided. The men continued upward. Their goal was a ridge southwest of the valley that they believed would reveal lower terrain on the opposite side. From there, perhaps they could see a road, a river, smoke, power lines, or any sign of civilization. By midday, the aircraft was far below them. From the slope, they finally understood why search pilots had missed it. The wreckage barely looked like an airplane. Snow covered most of the fuselage. The wings blended into the ground. Shadows from the mountains crossed the valley during much of the day. Unless someone already knew exactly where to look, the aircraft could disappear into the landscape. They climbed higher. Wind increased as they approached the ridge. The protected valley behind them had hidden the true severity of conditions at higher elevations. Snow moved across the surface in long streams. Every exposed section of skin became painful within minutes. Talking required effort. Late in the afternoon, they reached what they believed was the top. They had expected to see descending terrain beyond it. Instead, another mountain range appeared. For several moments, neither man spoke. The damaged map had given them hope that civilization might be relatively close, but the landscape suggested otherwise. Ridge after ridge extended toward the horizon. Between them lay deep valleys filled with snow and forest. There was no road, no building, no smoke. Turning back would have been understandable. They discussed it. The aircraft still offered shelter. They could return before the next day if conditions remained stable. Continuing meant spending the night away from the fuselage with almost no proper camping equipment. Then one of them noticed something. Far to the southwest, the mountains seemed lower. It was not much, just a change in the horizon. But it suggested that the range eventually opened into lower country. They decided to continue. That choice immediately created another problem. Daylight was disappearing. They descended from the ridge and searched for protection from the wind. Eventually, they found a shallow depression beside several exposed rocks. Using snow and pieces of material they carried, they created a crude barrier. It was not comfortable and barely qualified as shelter, but it reduced the wind enough for them to remain there overnight. Back at Flight 214, the remaining survivors prepared for another freezing night. Nobody knew how far the two volunteers had traveled. Some believed they would return the following morning after discovering the mountains were impossible to cross. Others hoped they would never return, because that might mean they had found help. The strange logic of survival had changed everything. Normally, seeing friends return safely would be good news. Here, their absence could mean salvation. The next morning, the two men resumed walking. Their progress became slower. The terrain forced them repeatedly to climb around obstacles and descend into valleys that did not appear on their damaged map. Snow concealed rocks and holes. More than once, one man disappeared suddenly into deep powder and required the others help to climb out. They rationed their food carefully. By afternoon, clouds began gathering behind them. Another storm was coming. They increased their pace, but the mountains dictated their speed. As visibility decreased, navigation became more difficult. Without the sun, maintaining direction depended largely on the terrain and the small compass they carried. Then they discovered something that changed the expedition. Near the bottom of a narrow valley, one of the men stopped beside a tree. There was a mark on its trunk. It was straight. Too straight. They moved closer. The mark had been made by a blade. Someone had cut into the tree. It might have happened months earlier. It might have happened years earlier. But it meant human beings had been there. The men began searching the surrounding area. Minutes later, they found another marked tree. Then another. The marks formed a rough line through the forest. For the first time since leaving the aircraft, they had evidence that they were moving toward a place used by people. They followed the markings until darkness forced them to stop. That night, despite the cold and exhaustion, both men believed they might be closer to civilization than they had imagined. The following morning, the storm arrived. Snow erased much of the landscape. Visibility dropped dramatically. The tree markings became difficult to locate. Several times they lost the trail and had to search backward until they found the previous mark. Then, shortly after midday, the forest opened. One of the men saw something running across the snow. Not an animal. A line. A narrow, uneven depression extending between the trees. They approached it and began clearing fresh snow with their boots. Beneath the new snowfall was packed ice. It was a trail, perhaps used by forestry workers, perhaps hunters, perhaps residents from some settlement beyond the mountains. They turned and followed it downhill. For hours, nothing appeared, but the trail continued, and that alone was enough. Then, late in the afternoon, one of the men stopped so suddenly that the other nearly walked into him. Ahead, between the trees, stood a wooden post. Attached to it was a weathered sign. Most of the lettering had faded, but an arrow remained visible. And beneath the arrow was a distance. 11 kilometers. Neither man knew exactly what waited 11 kilometers away. But the sign proved one thing beyond doubt. They were no longer lost in untouched wilderness. Somewhere ahead, there were people. 11 kilometers would have seemed like nothing before the crash. A short drive. A distance crossed without thought. But after days in the mountains, weakened by cold and limited food, 11 kilometers through deep snow could consume the remaining strength of both men. They studied the weathered sign carefully, hoping to identify the name of whatever settlement or station lay ahead. Most of the lettering was unreadable. Only the arrow and distance remained clear enough to understand. They followed it. The trail descended gradually through the forest, and that alone gave them hope. Lower elevation meant warmer temperatures, thicker vegetation, and a greater possibility of roads or permanent buildings. They began noticing additional evidence of human activity. Several trees had been cut years earlier. A rusted metal marker appeared beside the trail. Later, they found what looked like an old drainage channel beneath the snow. Civilization was close, but their bodies were reaching their limits. They had been surviving on tiny portions of food while spending enormous amounts of energy, simply remaining warm. Now, every kilometer demanded more. They stopped frequently, not because they wanted to rest, but because their legs refused to continue at the same pace. Neither man wanted to discuss what would happen if the sign pointed toward an abandoned facility. That possibility followed them silently. The trail might have been used only during summer. The building ahead might be empty throughout winter. Even if they reached it, they could still be many miles from another person. As evening approached, the forest grew darker. The storm had weakened, but clouds remained low over the mountains. They knew they could not cover the entire distance before nightfall. Then they smelled something. At first, one man thought he imagined it. Smoke. They stopped. The wind shifted, and the smell disappeared. Several minutes later, it returned. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant people. Suddenly, they were moving faster than they had all day. They followed the trail around a bend and descended toward a small frozen stream. On the opposite side, partially hidden among the trees, something dark stood against the snow. A roof. One man shouted. No answer came. They crossed the stream carefully and climbed toward the structure. As they approached, they saw a narrow column of smoke rising from a metal chimney. Someone was inside. The first man reached the door and struck it with his hand. Nothing happened. He knocked again. A sound came from inside. The door opened. An older forestry worker stood there, staring at two figures who barely resembled ordinary travelers. Their clothing was layered and damaged. Their faces showed the effects of days in extreme weather. Their improvised equipment made it obvious that something unusual had happened. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then one of the men said the words they had been repeating in their minds throughout the journey. We were on Flight 214. The forestry worker continued staring at them. He knew the number. Almost everyone in the region did. The disappearance had dominated newspapers and radio reports for more than 2 weeks. Search operations had been reduced. Public statements had become increasingly pessimistic. Most people believed there was little possibility anyone remained alive. Yet, 2 passengers were standing outside his cabin. The worker brought them inside immediately. The warmth was almost overwhelming after so much time in the cold. He gave them blankets and something warm to drink while trying to understand their story. There had been a crash. Others were alive. The aircraft was somewhere beyond the mountains. How many survivors? The men gave the best estimate they could. The worker's expression changed. This was no longer the discovery of 2 extraordinary survivors. There were people still waiting. The nearest reliable communication point was several kilometers away at a forestry station connected to the regional network. Weather conditions made immediate travel difficult, but waiting until morning could cost valuable time. The worker prepared his vehicle and attempted to reach the station that evening. The 2 survivors remained inside the cabin. For the first time since the crash, they were somewhere designed for human habitation. There were walls untouched by impact, a functioning stove, dry clothing, ordinary furniture. The simplicity of those objects felt almost unreal. But neither man could relax. Every minute mattered. Back at the aircraft, nobody knew they had succeeded. The survivors there were entering another night believing the 2 volunteers might have disappeared somewhere in the mountains. Hours passed. Then, shortly before midnight, the forestry worker reached the communication station. The message he delivered was so unexpected that the operator initially asked him to repeat it. 2 men claiming to be passengers from the missing aircraft had arrived alive. There were additional survivors at the crash site. Coordinates were unknown. Immediate rescue assistance was required. The message moved quickly through emergency channels. Officials who had spent weeks searching for wreckage were awakened. Maps were unfolded again. Search coordinators contacted aviation units. The original rescue operation, which had been slowly winding down, suddenly returned to full urgency. But there was a problem. The 2 men could not provide precise coordinates. They had walked for days through mountains, following ridges, valleys, marked trees, and an old trail. Their damaged map was incomplete. They could describe the route, but translating those memories into an exact location from the air would be difficult. Rescuers needed to reconstruct their journey backward. The forestry workers showed officials the trail the men had followed. Maps of logging routes and mountain passes were compared with their descriptions. One survivor remembered the shape of several distinctive peaks visible from the crash site. Another remembered the direction of the valley and the approximate position of the sun during their climb. Piece by piece, a new search area emerged. It was west of the region that had received most of the earlier attention, much farther west than investigators had believed Flight 214 could have traveled. At dawn, rescue aircraft were prepared. Weather remained uncertain, and clouds still covered many of the higher peaks. Helicopters would attempt to follow the route described by the survivors while fixed-wing aircraft searched the surrounding valleys. The two men wanted to go with them. Doctors objected. They were exhausted and needed treatment, but one of them insisted that he could recognize the mountains. Eventually, rescuers agreed. Shortly after sunrise, a helicopter lifted from the regional base, with one survivor aboard. For him, seeing the mountains from the air was almost disorienting. Valleys that had taken hours to cross passed beneath the helicopter in minutes. Ridges that had seemed endless now appeared as pieces of a vast white landscape. He searched for familiar shapes. The helicopter followed the forestry trail, then the marked trees, then the valley where the men had spent one of their nights. From there, they climbed toward the higher mountains. Clouds reduced visibility. The pilot circled one ridge and entered another valley. The survivor shook his head. Wrong one. They continued. Another ridge. Another valley. Still wrong. Fuel was becoming a concern. The pilot explained that they could not remain indefinitely. Then the survivor leaned toward the window. Ahead stood a mountain with a distinctive broken peak. He recognized it. They were close. The helicopter turned. They crossed the ridge. Below them appeared a narrow valley filled with snow and shadow. At first, the crew saw nothing. Then one rescuer pointed toward a strange line near the base of the slope. The helicopter descended. The line became larger. Metal appeared beneath the snow. A wing. Then the fuselage. Flight 214. The helicopter circled once. Movement appeared near the wreckage. Figures were emerging from the shelter. People were running into the open. Inside the helicopter, nobody needed confirmation. They had found them. After weeks of searching, Flight 214 had finally been located. And there were survivors standing in the snow. At first, the survivors beside Flight 214 did not react. They had heard aircraft before. Too many times they had rushed into the snow, waved desperately toward the sky, and watched another plane disappear beyond the mountains. The sound of an engine no longer guaranteed hope. Some remained inside the fuselage, unwilling to spend precious energy on another aircraft that might never see them. Then the sound became louder. This was different. It was not passing high above the valley. It was approaching. One survivor stepped outside and looked toward the ridge. Seconds later, a helicopter appeared above the mountain. He shouted. People rushed from the shelter. Blankets, pieces of fabric, jackets. Anything visible was raised into the air. Some survivors stumbled as they moved through the snow. Others simply stood beside the wreckage staring upward. The helicopter crossed directly above them. Then it turned. That turn changed everything. Every aircraft they had seen before had continued away. This one came back. The helicopter circled the wreckage slowly while the crew studied the terrain. Landing immediately was impossible. Deep snow covered much of the valley, and the steep surrounding slopes created dangerous air currents. The pilot needed to identify a stable area while also considering the possibility of hidden rocks beneath the snow. Inside the helicopter, the passenger who had walked out of the mountains looked down at the people he had left behind. They were alive. For days, he had carried the fear that something might happen before rescuers returned. Another storm, a collapse of part of the wreckage, the gradual weakening caused by cold and hunger. Now he could see people moving below. The expedition had worked. The helicopter descended enough for the survivors to see the crew clearly. One rescuer signaled toward them. People below began embracing. Some cried openly. Others appeared almost expressionless, as though their minds could not yet accept that the waiting was ending. But the rescue would not be immediate. The number of survivors exceeded the helicopter's capacity, and several required assistance before they could be moved. More aircraft would have to reach the valley. Medical teams needed to prepare. Weather conditions were deteriorating again. The first helicopter eventually located a possible landing area some distance from the wreckage. After touching down, rescuers moved toward the aircraft carrying emergency supplies. The moment they reached the survivors was strangely quiet. There were no dramatic speeches. No celebration prepared for cameras. Just exhausted people meeting the first outsiders they had seen since the crash. Rescuers distributed food cautiously and examined the survivors. Many were weakened by prolonged exposure and limited nutrition. Some had injuries dating from the crash that had never received proper treatment. Yet the simple fact that so many had endured the conditions astonished the rescue team. One rescuer later described the shelter as an extraordinary example of improvisation. The survivors had transformed part of a broken aircraft into a crude winter refuge. Openings had been blocked. Materials had been reused repeatedly. Supplies had been organized with increasing discipline as the days passed. But there was little time to study the site. Another storm was approaching. Radio messages confirmed that additional helicopters were preparing to enter the valley. The first priority was determining who needed evacuation most urgently. The survivors were told something they had waited weeks to hear. They were going home. For some, those words produced immediate relief. For others, they created complicated emotions. The wreckage had been a prison, but it had also become the structure around which their survival depended. Every routine they had developed was connected to it. Leaving meant accepting that the strange world they had inhabited for weeks was ending. The first group was prepared for evacuation. When the helicopter lifted away, those remaining watched until it disappeared beyond the ridge. This time, nobody feared it would forget them. More helicopters came. One by one, survivors were transported out of the valley. Each flight carried people across mountains that had seemed impossible to escape on foot. The journey took minutes. At the regional base, medical teams waited alongside officials and stunned relatives who had traveled there after receiving confirmation that passengers had survived. News spread rapidly. Radio stations interrupted regular programming. Newspapers prepared special editions. Families who had spent weeks expecting the worst suddenly received telephone calls telling them something almost impossible. Their relatives had been found alive. But while the world focused on the survival story, investigators were already asking another question. How had Flight 214 ended up there? The crash site was significantly outside the area where most of the search effort had been concentrated. Investigators began comparing the aircraft's actual location with its planned route and last known position. The difference was disturbing. Something had happened before the crash that neither controllers nor search coordinators had fully understood. When investigators eventually entered the cockpit wreckage, they recovered instruments, documents, and damaged equipment that might help reconstruct the final flight. They also found evidence suggesting the pilots had been fighting a navigation problem long before the aircraft struck the mountain. The disappearance of Flight 214 was beginning to make sense, and the explanation would reveal how a relatively small error, combined with extreme weather, had moved an entire aircraft outside the world that was searching for it. When investigators finally reached the wreckage of Flight 214, one question dominated everything else. How could an aircraft carrying 43 people disappear so completely while hundreds of hours were spent searching for it? The answer was not a single catastrophic failure. It was a sequence of small problems that became dangerous only when they occurred together. Investigators began reconstructing the final portion of the flight using radio records, weather reports, navigation charts, testimony from survivors, and instruments recovered from the damaged cockpit. What emerged was a picture of an aircraft gradually moving away from the position everyone on the ground believed it occupied. The storm had strengthened faster than expected, producing powerful winds across the mountains. Flight 214 had altered course while attempting to avoid the worst weather, and those changes, combined with wind drift and limited visibility, had pushed the aircraft west of its intended route. The difference was not immediately obvious to the crew because the pilots were navigating through dense cloud with almost no visual reference to the terrain below. Radio navigation signals in the region were also less dependable among the mountains, where ridges could interfere with reception and make precise positioning more difficult. By the time the crew realized their position might be wrong, they were already approaching terrain they did not expect to encounter. The final descent became particularly important. Investigators believe the pilots thought they were approaching a wider valley where lower altitude would place them beneath some of the cloud and improve visibility. If their estimated position had been correct, the maneuver would have made sense. But Flight 214 was actually approaching a different section of the mountain range. Instead of open terrain ahead, there were steep ridges hidden inside the storm. When the mountains finally appeared through the cloud, the crew had only seconds to react. Engine power increased, and the aircraft began climbing, but the distance was insufficient. The wing struck the snow-covered slope, and the aircraft descended into the narrow valley where the survivors would remain hidden for weeks. Ironically, the same extraordinary snowfall that contributed to the accident probably helped many passengers survive the impact. Deep snow absorbed energy as the aircraft slid across the slope, reducing the violence of the final stop. But within hours, that same snow began concealing the wreckage. Search planners faced an almost impossible problem. They did not know the aircraft's true position during its final minutes, so they constructed a probable search area using the information available to them. Radar coverage over the mountains was incomplete, and the last reliable communications placed Flight 214 closer to its planned route. Search crews therefore concentrated on valleys and ridges east of the actual crash site. The real location was close enough for survivors occasionally to hear aircraft, but far enough outside the main search corridor that pilots rarely passed directly over the valley. Even when they did, identifying the wreckage was extraordinarily difficult. From the ground, the broken fuselage seemed enormous. From thousands of feet above, surrounded by an endless landscape of snow, it became almost invisible. The upper surfaces of the aircraft were pale, the wings were partially buried, and drifting snow repeatedly covered the dark sections that might have attracted attention. Shadows cast by the surrounding peaks changed throughout the day, further disguising the shape. Investigators compared search flight records with the survivors' memories and discovered something painful. Aircraft had indeed passed near the crash site several times. On at least one occasion, a search plane had crossed close enough for survivors to believe they had certainly been seen. But the crew had been examining another section of terrain and never identified the irregular shape below as Flight 214. There was no negligence implied by this discovery. The mountains simply created a search environment in which a large aircraft could disappear surprisingly well. Search pilots had thousands of square miles to inspect, often while dealing with turbulence, cloud, glare from the snow, and strict fuel limitations. Every valley contained rocks, shadows, fallen trees, and irregular formations that could briefly resemble wreckage. The survivors had been visible, but only to someone who already knew exactly where to look. The investigation also explained why the emergency equipment had failed to bring rescuers directly to them. Damage from the crash had affected important systems, and the geography of the valley made radio communication extremely difficult. Surrounded by steep mountains, the survivors were effectively sitting at the bottom of a natural barrier. Their attempts to create visual signals faced similar problems. Dark material arranged on the snow could be covered within hours. Wind moved objects. New snowfall erased tracks and softened the long scar created by the aircraft's descent. Every day the wreckage became slightly more integrated into the landscape. By the second week, Flight 214 was easier to identify from the ground than from the sky. For the families, these explanations produced conflicting emotions. They were grateful that people had survived, but many struggled with the knowledge that rescue aircraft had sometimes been so close. Some asked whether the search should have expanded farther west sooner. Others questioned whether authorities had reduced operations too quickly. Search officials defended the decisions by pointing to the information available at the time. Without evidence that the aircraft had traveled significantly west of its expected position, sending limited aircraft across every valley in the enormous mountain range would have been extremely difficult. The search had already covered vast areas under dangerous conditions. What ultimately solved the mystery was not technology or a new calculation. It was the decision of two survivors to walk out of the valley and find another human being. The damaged map carried by those men became an important part of the investigation. Their route through the mountains showed just how isolated the crash site had been. Even after reaching the forestry worker, they could not simply point to a precise location. Rescuers had to reconstruct the journey backward using trails, mountain shapes, remembered directions, and forestry maps. Only when one survivor entered the helicopter and recognized a distinctive peak could the final valley be located. That detail demonstrated how misleading the landscape could be. From the ground, every ridge had seemed unique. From the air, dozens of valleys appeared almost identical. As investigators continued examining the wreckage, they found no evidence of a mysterious mechanical catastrophe or unexplained event. The story was more ordinary, and, because of that, perhaps more unsettling. Weather, navigation uncertainty, incomplete information, difficult terrain, and a sequence of decisions had combined until Flight 214 was somewhere nobody expected it to be. There had been no single moment when everyone understood that the aircraft was lost. The separation between its believed position and its actual position had grown gradually, almost invisibly, until the difference became fatal. But the investigation answered only what had happened in the air. Another story was emerging from inside the wreckage itself. Doctors and rescuers wanted to understand how a group of ordinary passengers, many with no wilderness experience, had survived for so long in conditions that experts had initially considered nearly impossible. Their survival had depended on more than the shelter provided by the aircraft. It depended on decisions made during the first hours, the organization that developed during the following days, and the willingness of strangers to cooperate when the normal structures of everyday life had disappeared. And as the survivors began describing those weeks in detail, rescuers realized that the most remarkable part of Flight 214's story had not happened during the crash. It had happened afterward. In the days after the rescue, doctors, investigators, and journalists repeatedly asked the survivors the same question. How had they managed to stay alive for so long? There was no single answer. Survival inside the valley had depended on dozens of small decisions made by people who, before boarding Flight 214, had never imagined they would need to survive in the mountains. Few had wilderness experience. None had prepared for weeks in extreme cold. Yet almost immediately after the crash, the group had begun adapting to circumstances that changed every hour. Their first important decision had been to remain inside the largest intact section of the fuselage. The aircraft was badly damaged, but it provided something more valuable than comfort: protection from the wind. Outside temperatures were dangerous, especially after sunset, and even a small reduction in exposure made an enormous difference. Survivors used luggage, broken seats, fabric, insulation, and pieces of interior paneling to close openings in the cabin. Every available blanket and coat was collected. At night, people stayed close together inside the protected area, conserving warmth while the temperature outside fell far below freezing. Water appeared to be abundant because snow surrounded them, but turning it into something useful required constant effort. Eating large quantities of snow directly would lower body temperature, so the survivors developed a routine for melting it using the limited equipment they had recovered. Clean snow was collected from specific areas away from the wreckage, then gradually melted and distributed. The process seemed simple, but it consumed time and energy every day. Food was far more difficult. During the first hours, passengers collected everything edible they could find in luggage and the aircraft's catering supplies. At first, portions were relatively generous because almost everyone believed rescue would arrive quickly. Once search aircraft repeatedly failed to locate them, the group understood that the supplies might need to last much longer. Every remaining item was counted, and portions became increasingly small. What had once been an ordinary snack became something valuable enough to divide carefully among several people. Hunger became a constant presence, but the survivors understood that consuming everything immediately would leave them with nothing if the search continued for weeks. Organization gradually became as important as physical resources. During the first day, people acted independently, responding to whatever problem appeared in front of them. Later, responsibilities developed naturally. Those who were physically stronger cleared snow and searched sections of the wreckage. Others cared for injured passengers, organized supplies, prepared water, reinforced the shelter, or watched the sky for aircraft. Nobody formally created a government inside the fuselage, but a basic structure emerged because chaos wasted energy. Arguments still happened. Fear, exhaustion, hunger, and uncertainty placed enormous pressure on everyone. Some wanted to use more energy creating signals outside. Others believed they should conserve strength. Some supported sending people across the mountains much earlier, while others considered leaving the aircraft unnecessarily dangerous. The most difficult disagreements usually concern the same question: should they continue waiting for rescue, or should someone attempt to find help? Time itself became difficult to manage. During ordinary life, days were divided by schedules, work, meals, appointments, and clocks. Inside the valley, almost all of those structures disappeared. The survivors began marking days so they would not lose track. Morning meant clearing accumulated snow, checking supplies, examining the shelter, and preparing for whatever weather arrived. Daylight hours were valuable because most outdoor work became dangerous after sunset. Evening meant sealing the shelter again and preparing for the long, cold night. Conversation helped maintain morale. People told stories about their families, discussed what they would do after returning home, and remembered ordinary things they had once considered unimportant. A warm room, a full meal, a shower, a telephone call. The possibility of seeing relatives again became something many used to push themselves through another night. Perhaps the most psychologically difficult moments came when aircraft passed nearby. The first sightings created enormous excitement. Survivors believed each plane represented certain rescue. But when aircraft repeatedly disappeared without reacting, hope became more dangerous. Some passengers stopped rushing outside every time they heard an engine because the disappointment afterward was exhausting. Others continued watching constantly. The group learned that survival required balancing hope with reality. They could believe rescue was possible, but they could not organize their entire existence around the assumption that it would happen tomorrow. The wreckage itself provided materials that had never been designed for survival, but could be adapted. Seat cushions became insulation. Fabric became additional layers of clothing. Pieces of metal were turned into simple tools. Reflective surfaces were used in attempts to signal aircraft. Luggage became barriers against wind. Almost nothing was discarded without first considering whether it could serve another purpose. The aircraft that had nearly killed them became the source of many of the things keeping them alive. The survivors also learned to understand the valley. They discovered which areas accumulated dangerous amounts of snow, which parts received sunlight longest, and where wind became strongest. They avoided unnecessary travel because every journey outside consumed energy. When someone had to move around the wreckage, others usually knew where that person was going. Small rules emerged not because anyone wanted authority, but because mistakes could become serious very quickly. Yet none of these adaptations solved their central problem. They could make their supplies last longer. They could reduce exposure to the cold. They could maintain the shelter. But they could not remain indefinitely. Every day weakened them slightly. Food continued disappearing. Injuries remained untreated. Another severe storm could damage the shelter beyond repair. Eventually, the decision to send 2 people across the mountains became unavoidable. It was the greatest risk the group had taken since the crash, but it was also the first action that gave them control over their own rescue. Doctors later concluded that several factors had worked in their favor. The central fuselage had remained intact enough to provide shelter. Snow had softened part of the crash impact. The survivors had recovered clothing and materials before the wreckage became deeply buried. Most importantly, they had cooperated. In a situation where every person acting independently could have exhausted supplies within days, the group gradually created a system that allowed them to endure far longer than rescuers originally thought possible. But the survivors themselves often described it differently. They did not consider themselves experts or extraordinary adventurers. Most said they had simply solved one problem at a time. They survived the first night because morning seemed reachable. Then they survived another day because rescue might arrive. When rescue did not come, they adapted again. Nobody stood inside the wreckage on the first day with a plan for surviving weeks. Survival emerged from hundreds of small choices repeated until those choices became routine. And when the helicopters finally arrived, those routines suddenly ended. The passengers who had spent weeks thinking only about cold, food, shelter, and rescue were returned within hours to hospitals, families, cameras, questions, and a world that had already begun turning their experience into a legend. For them, however, the story was not yet finished. Because surviving the mountain was one thing, learning how to live normally again after everyone had believed they were dead would prove to be something entirely different. The first helicopters carrying survivors landed to a scene nobody had expected to witness. Medical teams had prepared for serious cases, officials had established a restricted area around the landing zone, and families had begun arriving after receiving confirmation that people from Flight 214 were alive. For weeks, those families had lived between uncertainty and grief. Some had refused to accept that their relatives were dead because no wreckage had been found. Others had gradually begun preparing themselves for the possibility that nobody would return. Then, in a matter of hours, everything changed. Names that had appeared on lists of missing passengers were suddenly attached to living people being carried from helicopters. The transformation was so abrupt that some relatives initially struggled to believe the telephone calls informing them of the rescue. The survivors themselves entered a world that felt almost unreal. After weeks surrounded by snow, damaged metal, darkness, and the same small group of people, they were suddenly inside warm buildings filled with doctors, nurses, lights, telephones, and unfamiliar voices. Ordinary objects seemed strangely noticeable. Running water, clean sheets, doors that closed properly, food that did not need to be divided into carefully measured portions. Even the constant noise of a hospital corridor felt overwhelming after nights when the only sounds had been wind against the fuselage and people breathing in the darkness. Doctors examined each survivor carefully and controlled their return to normal eating and activity. Families wanted immediate reunions, journalists wanted stories, investigators wanted testimony, but medical teams insisted that recovery had to come first. When relatives were finally allowed to see them, many reunions happened quietly. The weeks of uncertainty had exhausted everyone. Some families had followed every search report, marking locations on maps and calling authorities for updates. Others had traveled to the region during the original operation and returned home only after officials reduced the search. Now the person they had imagined lost forever was sitting in front of them. Survivors later described those meetings as more difficult to explain than the rescue itself. During the mountain ordeal, they had concentrated on practical problems because practical problems could be solved. Find insulation, melt snow, repair the shelter, watch for aircraft. Once they were safe, emotions that had been delayed for weeks finally had room to surface. Outside the hospitals, the story spread rapidly. Newspapers printed photographs of the wreckage and maps showing how far Flight 214 had drifted from its expected route. Television crews gathered outside medical facilities. Reporters traveled toward the forestry station where the two passengers had first reached civilization. The public became fascinated by every detail: the storm, the crash, the failed searches, the improvised shelter, the walk across the mountains, and finally the helicopter appearing over the valley. The two men who had left the aircraft received particular attention. Newspapers described their journey as an extraordinary act of courage, but both repeatedly redirected attention toward the people who had remained behind. They argued that the expedition had only been possible because the entire group had worked together long enough to give them the opportunity to leave. For investigators, the survivors' testimony was essential. Each person remembered different fragments of the final flight. One recalled the turbulence becoming stronger. Another remembered the change in engine sound. Passengers near windows described brief glimpses of terrain through the clouds. Crew members provided more technical information about what had happened before impact. Individually, these memories were incomplete. Together, they helped investigators reconstruct the final minutes. The emerging conclusion remained consistent. Flight 214 had not vanished because of one mysterious event. The aircraft had gradually moved away from its expected position until weather and terrain created a situation from which the crew could not fully recover. The survivors also learned how close the search had come to finding them. When investigators showed them flight paths from the original operation, several recognized approximate times when aircraft had been heard above the valley. Search planes had passed nearby. One had crossed astonishingly close. That knowledge was difficult for some survivors. They remembered standing in the snow, waving everything they could find while believing the aircraft above had seen them. Discovering that the crews had never identified the wreckage made those moments even more haunting. Yet many also understood the scale of the problem after seeing aerial photographs. The aircraft that looked enormous from beside the wreckage became almost indistinguishable when photographed from altitude. White metal disappeared against snow. Shadows broke apart its outline. The valley itself seemed like one among hundreds. Attention eventually shifted toward the decision to reduce the search. Families questioned whether officials had given up too early. Search coordinators responded that operations had never completely stopped, but resources had been reduced as the probability of survival appeared to decline. From their perspective at the time, nearly 2 weeks in extreme winter conditions without a confirmed crash location made survival seem increasingly unlikely. The controversy would continue, but Flight 214 eventually influenced discussions about how search areas were calculated when aircraft disappeared in mountainous regions. Investigators emphasized that predicted routes could not always be treated as reliable boundaries, especially when strong winds and navigation uncertainty were involved. For the survivors, public debate mattered less than rebuilding ordinary life. Some recovered quickly and avoided speaking about the crash whenever possible. Others remained in contact with people they had met aboard the aircraft. Relationships created inside the wreckage did not always continue afterward, but there was an understanding among them that few outsiders could completely share. They had known one another in circumstances where careers, possessions, and social status had become almost meaningless. Inside the fuselage, the important questions had been simpler. Who needed help? Who could work? How much food remained? Would the weather hold? Would anyone find them? Several survivors returned to the crash region months later, although not all wanted to see it again. By then, warmer weather had transformed the valley. Snow had retreated, revealing rocks, vegetation, and much more of the aircraft. The landscape that had seemed like an endless white prison now looked completely different. Investigators and recovery teams had removed important equipment, personal belongings, and sections required for examination. The wreckage remained damaged and silent against the mountainside. Standing there without the winter storm, it was difficult to imagine how completely the aircraft had disappeared. That contrast became one of the enduring lessons of Flight 214. The passengers had never been impossibly far from civilization. Search aircraft had sometimes been relatively close. A forestry trail existed beyond the mountains. Yet weather, terrain, distance, and incomplete information had created an invisible wall between the survivors and everyone looking for them. For weeks, two worlds had existed almost beside each other. In one, families were being told that survival was increasingly unlikely. In the other, passengers were waking every morning, clearing snow from a broken aircraft, and waiting for someone to look in exactly the right place. Eventually, someone did. But years later, one detail from the investigation would continue to trouble those who studied the disappearance. Flight 214 had been missed not because nobody searched for it, but because everyone had been searching according to an assumption that seemed completely reasonable. And that assumption had been wrong. The investigation into Flight 214 eventually ended, but the questions raised by the disappearance continued long afterward. Aviation authorities studied not only the accident itself, but also the search that followed it. The most important lesson was uncomfortable because it exposed a weakness that could never be eliminated completely. Rescuers could only search effectively when they had a reasonably accurate idea of where an aircraft had disappeared. In the case of Flight 214, almost every decision during the first days had been based on information that seemed reliable. Controllers knew the planned route. They had the final radio communications. Investigators could estimate speed, direction, wind, and fuel. Search coordinators used those details to construct an area where the aircraft was most likely to be found. The logic was sound. The problem was that Flight 214 was not there. A combination of stronger than expected winds, course changes, limited navigation information, and the confusion created by severe weather had moved the aircraft beyond the area where search planners expected it to be. Once that incorrect assumption entered the search process, hundreds of people could work with extraordinary dedication and still fail to find what they were looking for. The accident became an example of why uncertainty had to be treated as something larger than a line on a map. Search planners reviewed how quickly operations should expand beyond an aircraft's predicted position when weather or navigation problems were involved. The case also renewed attention on emergency communication equipment and the difficulty of transmitting signals from deep mountain valleys. Technology would improve dramatically in later decades. Navigation became more precise. Satellite systems transformed the ability of aircraft to determine position, emergency transmitters improved, and search coordinators gained tools that previous generations could hardly have imagined. Yet the fundamental lesson remained relevant. Technology was only useful when the information it produced could reach someone. Flight 214 had crashed into a place where mountains, weather, and damaged equipment combined to isolate the survivors almost completely. There was another lesson, one that had little to do with aircraft instruments. Experts examining the survival of the passengers repeatedly returned to the importance of cooperation. The people aboard Flight 214 had not been selected for an expedition. They were ordinary travelers who happened to buy tickets for the same flight. They had different ages, personalities, professions, and physical abilities. Before departure, many had never spoken to one another. After the crash, those differences became secondary. The group needed shelter, water, organization, and a way to attract rescuers. Every useful object had to be shared. Every unnecessary expenditure of energy mattered. People who had skills used them. Those who were stronger performed tasks others could not. Injured passengers depended on people who had been strangers that morning. Their survival was not the result of a perfect plan created immediately after impact. It was the result of repeated adaptation. The decision to send 2 passengers across the mountains remained the most debated choice the group made. Traditional survival guidance often emphasized staying with wreckage because an aircraft was easier to locate than individuals traveling through wilderness. For much of their ordeal, remaining beside Flight 214 had probably been the correct decision. The fuselage provided shelter and materials, and leaving immediately after the crash would have exposed people to an environment they did not understand. But circumstances changed. Search aircraft became less frequent. Food declined. The survivors realized that waiting indefinitely could be as dangerous as walking. Their eventual decision demonstrated something survival experts would later emphasize when discussing the case. Rules could guide decisions, but conditions determined whether those rules still made sense. The 2 volunteers had not known whether civilization lay beyond the mountains. They had possessed an incomplete map, limited supplies, improvised clothing, and only a rough idea of their position. What saved the expedition was not certainty, but evidence accumulated along the way. A marked tree suggested human activity. Additional markings suggested a route. A trail confirmed that people traveled through the forest. A weathered sign provided direction. Finally, smoke from a chimney led them to another person. At every stage, they adjusted their plan according to what the landscape revealed. Had they chosen another valley or missed the forestry markings beneath fresh snow, the outcome might have been very different. For years afterward, the forestry worker who opened his door to the 2 survivors remained connected to the story. He had not crossed the mountains or survived the crash. He had simply been in the right place when 2 exhausted strangers appeared from the snow. Yet without that cabin, the men might have needed to continue much farther before finding communication. His immediate decision to seek help transformed their journey into a rescue operation. It was another reminder that extraordinary historical events sometimes depend on completely ordinary moments. A person noticing something unusual, opening a door, believing an unbelievable story, and deciding to act. The valley itself gradually returned to silence. Once recovery operations ended, there was little reason for anyone to remain there. Winter storms continued covering the mountains every year. Snow accumulated and disappeared with the seasons. The scar created by the aircraft became less visible. Vegetation returned around disturbed areas. Flight 214 slowly changed from an active disaster site into a place connected mainly with memory. For the survivors, however, the valley never disappeared completely. Some avoided flying for years. Others eventually returned to aircraft because work or family required it. A few said flying itself was less difficult than encountering heavy snow or hearing certain sounds that reminded them of the fuselage during storms. Many preferred not to be described as heroes. They knew how frightened they had been. They remembered disagreements, exhaustion, uncertainty, and moments when optimism became difficult. The public wanted a simple story about courage. The people who lived through it remembered something more complicated. They remembered that survival rarely felt heroic while it was happening. It felt like work. Clear the snow. Protect the shelter. Count the supplies. Help the injured. Watch the sky. Get through another night. Then repeat everything the next morning. Perhaps that was why the story remained powerful. There had been no extraordinary technology waiting inside Flight 214 to save them. There had been no rescue team that immediately knew their location. For weeks, the passengers possessed little more than damaged shelter, limited supplies, each other, and the belief that somewhere beyond the mountains there were people still looking for them. And there were. They were simply looking in the wrong place. The disappearance of Flight 214 became remembered not because an aircraft vanished into some unexplained mystery, but because it demonstrated how easily distance can be created by uncertainty. The survivors were never beyond reach in a literal sense. Aircraft crossed the mountains above them. Search teams worked nearby. Civilization existed beyond several ridges. Yet, until the correct location became known, all of those things might as well have been on another continent. One wrong assumption had hidden an entire aircraft. One decision to walk had revealed it again. And decades later, that remained the haunting image associated with Flight 214, a broken passenger plane slowly disappearing beneath the snow while people inside listened to rescue aircraft passing somewhere above them, unable to understand why nobody could see them. They had survived the crash. They had survived the cold. They had survived long enough for the world to believe they were gone. And when the mountains finally gave them back, their story became a reminder that sometimes the difference between being lost forever and being found is not measured in hundreds of miles. Sometimes it is only one ridge. Years after Flight 214 disappeared, the valley where the aircraft came to rest looked nothing like the place the survivors remembered. During winter it could still become an almost completely white landscape, but in warmer months the snow retreated toward the highest slopes, revealing dark rock, streams, grass, and dense areas of forest. Without the storm, the valley no longer seemed completely cut off from the world. From certain points, the route toward the lower country could be recognized. Forestry trails that had been invisible beneath deep snow became obvious. The mountains were still enormous, but they no longer formed the same apparently endless prison that had surrounded the passengers after the crash. This difference fascinated investigators and later visitors because it demonstrated how completely weather could transform geography. A place that seemed navigable during summer could become almost unrecognizable beneath winter snow. Most of the wreckage had been examined during the investigation, and important components had been removed, but traces of the accident remained for years. Pieces of metal were found among rocks and vegetation. Small fragments appeared as snow melted. Objects that had once belonged inside an ordinary passenger aircraft became part of the landscape. For survivors who returned, these fragments carried memories that photographs could not reproduce. A section of damaged fuselage was not simply metal. It had once been a wall protecting them from the wind. A broken seat had once provided material for insulation. An opening in the aircraft marked the place where people had climbed outside each morning to examine the sky. Some survivors never returned. They saw no reason to. The valley had taken enough from them, and revisiting it offered nothing they wanted. Others felt differently. They wanted to see the mountains without fear, without hunger, and without the expectation that another storm could determine whether they lived through the night. Returning under a clear sky allowed them to understand distances that had been impossible to judge while trapped there. The ridge crossed by the two volunteers was visible from the crash site. It looked close. Anyone seeing it in photographs might assume reaching it would be easy, but walking toward it revealed the deception of scale. The slope was longer and steeper than it appeared, and deep winter snow had multiplied the difficulty of every step. The old forestry route also became part of the story. During the rescue, it had been merely a practical connection between wilderness and civilization. Later, people understood how extraordinary it was that the two men had found it at all. Their path from the aircraft had not followed a clearly marked road. They had crossed terrain where small changes in direction could have placed them in another valley entirely. The first cut mark on a tree had been almost insignificant, yet it became the clue that changed everything. Had fresh snow covered it completely, the men might have continued in another direction. Had they reached the ridge during heavier cloud, they might never have identified the lower terrain to the southwest. Survival had depended on planning and endurance, but chance had also played a role. That idea made some survivors uncomfortable. People naturally wanted the story to have a clear explanation. They wanted to believe that every correct decision inevitably produced the successful outcome. The reality was less reassuring. Many things could have gone differently. The aircraft could have struck exposed rock instead of deep snow. The central fuselage could have broken apart completely. The storm could have destroyed their shelter. The volunteers could have missed the forestry trail. The helicopter carrying one of them back toward the crash site could have been forced to turn around before the distinctive peak appeared through the clouds. Their survival was not evidence that the mountains had somehow protected them. It was evidence that human decisions, environmental conditions, and chance had aligned just enough for survival to remain possible. As anniversaries of the accident passed, public interest gradually faded. New disasters replaced old ones in newspapers. Aviation technology advanced. Aircraft navigation became increasingly precise, and the idea that a commercial flight could drift so far from its expected position became harder for younger generations to understand. Yet among search and rescue professionals, the story continued to be discussed because the underlying problem had never completely disappeared. Modern equipment could dramatically reduce uncertainty, but every search still began with information, and information could be incomplete. Flight 214 demonstrated the danger of allowing the most likely location to become the only location considered. The survivors carried another lesson that could not be written easily into aviation procedures. During interviews years later, many struggled to identify the moment when they realized they might actually survive. There was no single moment. Hope changed constantly. When an aircraft passed overhead, it increased. When the sound disappeared, it collapsed. When supplies were counted, fear returned. When the two volunteers left, some believed rescue was closer while others feared the group had just lost two people. Even when the helicopter finally appeared, several survivors hesitated before celebrating because they had experienced disappointment too many times. Only when the helicopter turned back toward them did they understand. That turn remained one of the clearest memories shared by the group. An aircraft had finally seen them. Years later, some could still describe exactly how the helicopter looked against the mountains, how it moved across the sky, and how everyone waited to see whether it would continue away like the others. It did not. It turned. For the survivors of Flight 214, that simple movement separated two parts of their lives. Before it, they were people missing in the mountains, uncertain whether anyone would ever find them. After it, they were survivors waiting to go home. The valley eventually became quiet again, as valleys always do. The helicopters left. Investigators left. Journalists left. Most physical evidence slowly disappeared beneath weather and time. But the story remained. Not because the mountain had hidden some supernatural secret, and not because Flight 214 had vanished without explanation. The truth was more unsettling precisely because it was possible. An aircraft had crashed. People had survived. Searchers had flown close enough to be heard. And for weeks, neither side knew how close they actually were. As the years passed, memories of Flight 214 changed. Certain details faded while others remained remarkably clear. Survivors sometimes forgot conversations from the hospital or the names of journalists who interviewed them afterward, but many could still remember the sound of wind moving through damaged sections of the fuselage. They remembered waking before sunrise and realizing from the temperature that another difficult day had begun. They remembered the silence that followed whenever a search aircraft disappeared beyond the mountains. Above all, they remembered the people around them. Before the flight, most had been strangers. Inside the valley, knowing someone's profession, income, or social position became almost meaningless. What mattered was whether a person could help reinforce the shelter, prepare water, care for someone who was struggling, search the wreckage for supplies, or simply keep another passenger calm during a long night. Several survivors later said that the experience permanently changed the way they understood dependence. Modern life encouraged the idea that people could function independently, but the mountain had removed that illusion within hours. The two passengers who crossed the mountains remained permanently associated with the rescue, although both resisted attempts to transform their journey into a simple, heroic legend. They knew how uncertain the expedition had been. They had not left the aircraft confident that they would succeed. They had left because the alternatives were disappearing. Food was running low, search flights were becoming less frequent, and nobody knew how long the damaged fuselage could continue protecting the group. Their walk was an act of determination, but it was also an act of desperation. Years later, when asked why they kept moving after reaching the first ridge and discovering more mountains beyond it, one of them gave a simple explanation. Going forward still offered the possibility of finding someone. Returning to the aircraft meant returning to the same problem. The forestry worker remembered the encounter differently. For him, the most extraordinary part was the moment the men identified themselves as passengers from Flight 214. He had heard reports about the disappearance and knew that official optimism had almost vanished. The idea that someone could emerge from the mountains after so long seemed impossible. Yet there they were. He did not need to understand every detail before acting. Other survivors were still waiting, and communication had to be established quickly. His role lasted only a short time compared with the weeks spent inside the valley, but without that connection between the two exhausted passengers and the outside world, the rescue might have been delayed again. Families remembered another version of the story. Their ordeal had taken place far from the snow. They had waited beside telephones, followed news reports, studied maps they barely understood, and tried to interpret the increasingly careful language used by officials. Early statements spoke about an active rescue operation. Later statements spoke about locating the aircraft. The change was subtle, but families understood what it meant. Expectations were shifting from rescue toward recovery. Some refused to accept it. Others began privately preparing for loss. Then the telephone rang, and everything they had been forcing themselves to accept became wrong. People believed dead were alive. Perhaps that was why the story continued to affect people long after the investigation ended. Flight 214 had created two completely different realities at the same time. Outside the mountains, hope decreased with every passing day. Inside the wreckage, survival continued one day at a time. Officials used probability because they had to make decisions with limited information. The survivors did not have that luxury. For them, probability meant nothing while they were still breathing. Their world had become immediate. They needed to survive the next night, then the next morning, then the next storm. Many survivors eventually returned to ordinary routines. They went back to work. Children grew older. Families changed. Decades passed. Some rarely discussed Flight 214. Others participated in anniversary interviews or meetings with people connected to the rescue. But the experience remained a dividing line in their lives. Everything before the mountain and everything after it. Small inconveniences acquired different proportions. Cold weather carried different associations. The sound of an aircraft sometimes brought memories that appeared without warning. Yet many also described an increased appreciation for ordinary stability. A warm house, a meal shared without counting portions, or simply knowing where loved ones were could carry a meaning that had not existed before. For search crews, the memories were different. Some pilots had difficulty accepting how close they had flown without identifying the wreckage. They reviewed conditions from those days and understood intellectually why the aircraft had been so difficult to see, but understanding did not completely remove the frustration. Search and rescue work often existed in that uncomfortable space between effort and uncertainty. A crew could fly directly past the place it was searching for and never know. Flight 214 became a reminder that failure to locate something did not necessarily mean it was far away. Sometimes it meant the landscape had hidden it extraordinarily well. The accident also demonstrated the danger of certainty. Controllers had good reasons to believe the aircraft was in one region. Search coordinators had good reasons to prioritize that region. Pilots had good reasons to follow the assigned sectors. No single decision explained why the wreckage remained undiscovered. The failure emerged from many reasonable assumptions reinforcing one another. That was perhaps the most valuable lesson investigators could take from the case. When information was uncertain, the search had to remain capable of questioning its own starting point. For the survivors, however, the enduring lesson was simpler. They remembered that nobody survived alone. Even the two men who eventually found help could only make the journey because others had helped preserve supplies, maintain shelter, and keep the group functioning long enough for the expedition to become possible. The rescue helicopter could only locate the valley because forestry workers, emergency coordinators, pilots, doctors, and the surviving passenger worked together to reconstruct the route. Flight 214 was found through a chain of people, each carrying one part of the solution. Years later, when winter returned to the mountains, snow once again covered the valley. From the air, the landscape became white and featureless. Someone flying overhead without knowing the story might never imagine that dozens of people had once waited below, watching the same sky and wondering whether they had been forgotten. They had not been forgotten. They had simply disappeared into the smallest space between what everyone believed and what was actually true. And sometimes, that space is large enough to hide an entire airplane. Decades later, the disappearance of Flight 214 would be remembered less for the technical details of the accident than for the extraordinary contradiction at the center of its story. An aircraft carrying dozens of people had vanished during a winter storm. Search teams had crossed the mountains looking for it. Families had waited while hope gradually disappeared. Officials had reached the point where survival seemed almost impossible. Yet throughout those same days, passengers were alive inside a damaged fuselage, sometimes hearing the very aircraft sent to find them. The distance between rescue and disaster had never been as great as anyone imagined. It was measured not in hundreds of miles, but in ridges, clouds, snow, and one incorrect understanding of where the aircraft had gone. The story also changed the way many people involved thought about disappearance itself. When something vanishes, there is a natural tendency to imagine that it must have traveled somewhere distant or inaccessible. Flight 214 demonstrated that an object could disappear while remaining surprisingly close. The aircraft had not entered some unknown territory. It had crashed inside a region surrounded by maps, flight routes, forestry trails, and communities. But mountains divided that familiar world into isolated pockets. A valley only a short distance from human activity could become almost completely disconnected during winter. Deep snow erased tracks. Storms eliminated visibility. Radio signals struggled against terrain. A white aircraft became another shape in a white landscape. Geography had not moved Flight 214 beyond civilization. It had simply prevented civilization from seeing it. For aviation authorities, improvements in navigation and emergency technology gradually reduced the possibility of a similar disappearance. Later generations of aircraft gained increasingly accurate positioning systems. Emergency transmitters became more effective. Satellites transformed communication and navigation. Search crews gained better mapping, imaging, and coordination tools. An aircraft's position could eventually be known with a precision unimaginable to the pilots of earlier decades. Yet no technological development made the lessons of Flight 214 completely obsolete. Systems could fail. Weather could interfere. Information could be misunderstood. Human beings could still become overly confident in an assumption because every available piece of evidence appeared to support it. Search professionals therefore remembered another part of the case. Uncertainty had to remain visible. A probable location was not the same thing as a confirmed location. A predicted route was not the same thing as an actual route. When evidence was incomplete, areas outside the expected path could not automatically be dismissed. Flight 214 had been sitting beyond the boundary of expectation, and that had almost been enough to leave its survivors undiscovered. But perhaps the greatest legacy belonged to the passengers themselves. They had boarded the aircraft expecting an ordinary journey and emerged from the mountains with an understanding of life that few people would ever experience. They had watched the normal structures of society disappear within minutes. Money could not purchase food in the valley. Professional titles could not produce warmth. Schedules and plans became irrelevant. What remained were fundamental human needs and the ability of people to cooperate under pressure. The survivors had disagreements. They experienced fear. They sometimes lost confidence that rescue would arrive. Their story was not powerful because everyone behaved perfectly. It was powerful because imperfect people continued solving problems despite exhaustion and uncertainty. They did not know how long they needed to survive. They did not know whether search aircraft would return. They did not know whether the two volunteers would find civilization. They simply continued. One day became another. One night became another. Until eventually the sound of a helicopter filled the valley. For the families, that sound existed only in stories told afterward. Their own moment had been a telephone ringing, a knock at a door, or an official saying words they had stopped expecting to hear. Survivors had been found. Some families had already begun mourning. Others had refused to. All of them had spent weeks trapped between possibilities. Then possibility became fact. They were alive. Years later, survivors were occasionally asked whether they considered the crash the worst event of their lives. Answers varied. Some said yes, without hesitation. Others described it as something that could not be categorized so simply. They had experienced fear and loss, but also cooperation, friendship, endurance, and a perspective that changed everything afterward. None suggested they would choose to experience it again. But many acknowledged that the people who walked out of the mountains were psychologically different from those who had boarded the aircraft. The valley remained the silent witness. Winter after winter, snow returned to the slopes. Storms moved across the ridges. Clouds descended until the mountains disappeared. Somewhere beneath those changing seasons remained the memory of an aircraft that had once become almost invisible. There were no supernatural forces involved. No unexplained disappearance. No impossible mystery. Only weather, geography, human error, incomplete information, and extraordinary survival. And perhaps that made the story more frightening, because everything that happened to Flight 214 was possible. A routine flight could become lost. A search could look in the wrong place. An aircraft could lie beneath passing rescue planes. And ordinary passengers could suddenly discover that staying alive depended on one another. Flight 214 disappeared from radar in minutes. It took weeks for the world to find it again. But the people aboard had never disappeared. They were there the entire time, waiting beneath the snow.